So if you would like to introduce yourselves, because it'll be on the screen,
Sure.
as it were, later on, when it's on the website. And then perhaps we could ask you some questions.
Sure, absolutely happy to do that. So, good afternoon. My name is Peter Ellingworth. I'm the Chief Executive of the Association of British Healthtech Industries. We're an industry association that represents the broader health technology landscape. That's everything from sutures, surgical dressings, through implantable devices, robots, artificial intelligence and data-enabled technologies. Our primary role as an organisation is to represent the industry to government and to the health service, and to work closely with associated arm's length bodies such as the regulator, MHRA, and also with stakeholders like the Royal Colleges and other bodies within the National Health Service in the UK. There is an element of us that also works internationally, helping UK companies to export, and in that regard we also support the government when it comes to foreign direct investment coming to the UK. The industry that we are gifted with looking after includes something like 3,500 companies. The vast majority, over 98%, will be small businesses in the UK, but of course the larger corporates will often be a mixture of nationalities, both from the Americas and from Europe and further afield. The industry employs somewhere around 121,000 people. It has an income of about 22 billion in the UK, and we have about 300 members. While that's arguably 10%, numerically it's substantially more than that in terms of proportion of that industry because of the large companies. My background's in health and other industries. I'm a businessman by background, but I don't have a medical degree or any medical qualification. My colleague Phil is one of a number of our leadership team who are experts in various fields: market access, procurement, technical regulatory, ethics, compliance and international. Phil, would you like to introduce?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for inviting me. Phil Brown, I'm the Director of Technical and Regulatory Matters at ABHI. I've been in the job for around very nearly 3 years now, and in that role I joined from industry, having worked for a number of medical companies for doing regulatory since about 1989, so that's covers the medical device directive as well as the new medical device regulation. I've worked for Smith & Nephew doing wound care and that sort of stuff, right the way through to orthopaedic companies doing hips and knees, as well as working with some newer companies doing human and animal tissue type implantations. So quite a broad brush to sort of healthcare, I think. As my boss Peter says, I have, as part of that, always worked with trade associations. I've worked very closely with the MHRA on some of their guidelines and sort of worked with them on how industry is working and dealing with newer technologies and that sort of stuff, which has been quite exciting work really when you sort of look at the sort of cutting edge of technologies as we are. So as I say, very broad brush, I think, sort of covering all of those technical and regulatory matters.
So
probably the only other qualifying statement I'd make is we work very closely with MedTech Europe, which is the European organisation that's similar to us. I sit on the board of that. We also work with AdvaMed, which is the US organisation. So there is strong alignment between the work we do with us.
So you're essentially a membership organisation?
Yes, we are.
And do you have people in the industry who are not members of yours?
Oh yes, absolutely, yes. I mean, there are, as I said, I think 3,500 companies in this space, and we have just under 300 members.
Right, okay. It's enough to
And
keep on.
yes. And in that respect, I mean, we do work with other smaller organisations. There are other very specialist organisations out there, for example, in anaesthesia, in respiratory, in imaging, and we will collaborate with those.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
The UK industry's got a very long SME tail,
Yeah.
so we sort of try to reach out pretty much to those SMEs as well as we do to our larger manufacturers. So in that respect, we sort of work closely with some of the innovation hubs around the UK, and we try to sort of work with them to sort of, particularly myself, raising the profile of regulation, getting them to understand regulation at an early stage so that they can then sort of try and place that into their product development processes and that sort of way.
So perhaps I could get on to the subject of mesh.
Absolutely.
And as I said, we've been meeting a lot of women who in fact have suffered greatly from the insertion of mesh into the pelvic regions. And one of the things that they're always telling us is that it takes such a long time for the negative outcomes that they've been suffering to be recognised, and for their concerns to be taken really seriously. I wondered if you have any role in that, if you would like to advise us anything on that.
Sure, be happy to talk about matters there. I mean, firstly, I'd like to say, of course, we're always concerned if there is any harm to patients. This industry is focused on improving patients' health, and sadly, along the way, sometimes that doesn't happen. And all of the regulations that we work with and where we try and work to improve them is focused around patient safety. That's not meant to be a vanilla statement, it's genuine, and the companies we work with would all say the same thing. I think in terms of the timelines on this, yes, it is a very long timeline. What we aren't party to is what individual companies have knowledge of and what the processes they go through within their own corporate structures. We operate at an industry level and are not privy to that commercial and confidence information they have. I think where we have worked, and you will have no doubt heard of the registries for particular therapeutic areas, in orthopaedics, in heart and cardiac surgery, then that's a place in which industry has found a way, I think, to work together very effectively with the clinical community to improve outcomes by having data that enables people to see what the effect of the procedures is and what the outcomes are.
So when the patients tell us that they haven't been taken seriously at all with their complaints, and in fact they talk about some of the problems that they've had with surgeons and with others, and although we appreciate there's some very good surgeons within the country, there certainly are some that have been in denial in the whole question of the insertion of mesh and the problems it's caused these women. Can you say really why aren't these concerns taken more seriously?
I can't comment on the individual cases within there. As I said, we're not privy to all of the information from those companies. But I think that most companies will work very closely in the development of a product with the clinical community, and once that product is out there in use, they're going to continue to do that. So, it is in everyone's interest, not least the patients, of course, that any problems are surfaced very quickly, and the work, and Phil will come on and comment on some of the changes to the regulatory system that are in place, are designed to highlight problems where they occur as soon as they can, because it's not in the company's interest to hide problems with products, because it is there to provide those that are safe for use, and if they're not safe for use in some manner, then they should be withdrawn if there's a problem with the product. Where the product is then used by a surgeon and you have the clinical involvement, I think that's a little more challenging. But I think this is where I come back to the point about registries. I think there is real benefit to having those, because then at a broader industry level there will be awareness. The other thing which I think, Phil, you might want to comment on is where we're part of a European database, the regulations we have are European, then there is more evidence available to us more quickly from a due diligence perspective across Europe. So if a problem occurs in a product, it could occur in another market first rather than the UK. Phil, do you want to talk about that?
But
Yeah.
aren't you surprised? Aren't you surprised though that women have been complaining about the insertion of mesh for over 10 years, and yet nobody's been listening. Nothing has been done about it, and we just wonder about the post-marketing surveillance, whether that has been sufficient.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the source of information should come from the patient, who feels that they have been they have received treatment that has been damaging to them.
Yeah, and I mean, it is, no one should sit here and say it's acceptable for a long period of time for people not to be listened to. The basis of any good business is you listen to your customers. And those customers, in our case, are two people in that respect. There is the patient involved, and there is the clinician or the clinical community. Again, I can only state that I don't have information on the individual cases, but I think that most companies that I would work with would understand the need for good listening to the customer and the patient. But I think the structural level in the regulations, that's something that has been in place, and we are about to go through, we're in the middle of implementing a new set of regulations which are designed to improve both the pre-market and the post-market surveillance of the quality of products. I think the registry point for me is that then brings us into when the product then goes into use with the surgeon, and that's where you have a different set of relationships which hopefully can learn from this experience, or must learn from it in fact, about how patients can be listened to and things can be improved for the future. But perhaps if we could just take you through some of the regulatory aspects.
I think it's interesting to sort of juxtapose what happens in the pharma world with what happens in the devices world. With devices where you have a lot of surgeon interaction into implantation, for example, you have a lot of stakeholders in the whole system. So a company or a manufacturer can manufacture a product and CE mark a product perfectly adequately, demonstrating safety, performance and quality of their product. But then it's used by lots of different stakeholders beyond that. So you have the surgeon, and there is I remember an old adage when I was working for an orthopedic company, for example, that said, well, if you've got a really good hip implant, but you have a surgeon who hasn't been trained properly, then it won't work. But conversely, if you have a hip implant which may be not that good, it will actually work brilliantly if you've got a fantastic surgeon. So there are lots of different interactions at play.
So there is variability, of course, in anything that involves surgery, and we understand that. But I think the point that we should really stress here is that the regulations are now moving to a circumstance where there is more pre-market and post-market surveillance. So while this is, of course, of no consolation to those who have been affected by these products and the surgery over 10 years ago, I think looking forward there is an improvement in place.
Yeah. So for a manufacturer, there's sort of the whole question of post-market surveillance and vigilance is all governed by what's in the regulation or in the directive as it was, and that's governed. That includes requirements for reporting times and for follow-up and how you deal with that. And that sort of interaction then sort of works with the MHRA. So if a manufacturer is presented with an adverse instance, that's always reported to the MHRA. Quite often manufacturers will do that, erring on the side of caution, to be fair. And actually looking at the numbers and looking at the graphs, I think that it's fair to say that manufacturers are probably quite diligent in the way that they actually present data. I know that last year, looking at the figures, there were around 18,000, something like that, 17,000 different adverse events that were reported in the UK on devices as a whole. But the majority of those, sort of 70% of them, were actually reported by industry.
But isn't that because they're mandated to do so? Because
they're mandated to do so. Now, whether or not there is a link which could be made, for example, to strengthen the reporting of some of the other stakeholders into that system, maybe that might speed some of those sorts of processes up. But certainly the sort of
What I was going to say is the mandatory reports that are made by manufacturers to the regulator, their primary data source comes from clinicians.
From clinicians and from...
what we had here is a situation where patients were reporting outcomes and clinicians were dismissing them.
Right.
So as a manufacturer, if you're relying primarily on clinician input, you're not getting the data you should be getting.
So then we're getting into the realms of the post-marketing surveillance requirements. So you have two different aspects of post-market work, I guess. First of all is the vigilance stuff, which is the reactive process of actually reporting adverse events and all that sort of stuff. But now, well, as part of the Medical Device Directive, and then more latterly now with the regulation, which is strengthening that sort of side of post-marketing surveillance, there is a requirement, again through the regulation, for companies or manufacturers to actually proactively go and seek that information. That information could come from a number of different sources. It doesn't necessarily have to come from patients or users. It could come from registries. It could come from clinicians themselves. It could come from nurses if those products are used in a home setting, for example. So dependent on the risk of the product that's presented to the patient, the length of time that product's been on the market, and the amount of post-marketing surveillance data which has already been received from that product, depends on how that data is actually retrieved. That information and the processes are actually then built into the quality management systems of companies, which is audited by the third-party notified bodies who are mandated by the MHRA to do the compliance work. So those processes are now actively being, always have been actually, actively reviewed independently by those notified bodies to see that they're adequate for their for the products that they're dealing with. As an output from that post-marketing surveillance, manufacturers are then obliged to feed that information back through their risk management processes. And again, that's another one of the strengthening sides of the medical device regulation. So risk management is one of those processes which is an iterative process. So that if these sorts of instances sort of arise in whichever product field you're dealing with, the company then should be looking at those and designing out those potential issues with the product so that the next iteration of product doesn't have any of those particular issues at hand. The ideal is to reduce those risks as scientifically possible, or as, I can't remember the exact term now, as state of the art, I think is the term that they use within the risk management standard itself. So that iterative process goes on and on. So it's not as if you do it once and then stop. You actually identify what the risks could be at the time of placing the product on the market. And then with your post-marketing work, you're actually then improving that risk management as you're actually getting more and more sales or more experience of your product as it works in the
so it's about assurance, not just control. And that ongoing assurance, I think, can only be greatly enabled by a closer feedback loop with the clinical community. Now, whether that's done direct, as in the case of some registries, or it's done through MHRA, we're more than happy to debate and discuss for the future how we can improve that. And I'll state that here as well. You know, this for us may be a one-time hearing, but this process of collaboration we are very committed to ongoing. And if it improves the outcome for patients, of course we're going to collaborate.
Can I just ask you, because I absolutely understand what you're saying once the product is on the market, but what do you do when the product actually can't be tested prior to its introduction? How do you balance then innovation with the product that the company wants to introduce? But how do we know that it is a safe product to be introduced? Because one of the things with mesh is that we really never had any sort of trials or anything that actually took into account what was happening, but prior to it being introduced, then there were no other sort of pilots or trials or anything like that?
Again, for the individual products, I can't comment, but normally you would expect there to be animal trials. Once you've gone through the technical assessment of the factors of the product, after animal trials, then there would be an assessment made and it would go into a first-in-man study. And from that, again, you would have observations about both the technical capabilities of the product and materials, but also then about the surgical procedures, if it is an implanted product.
I think the concern here is that I think this is a genuine problem for everyone. It's not just the industry that if you devise a product that is designed to be in the human body for up to a lifetime, to last a person a lifetime.
Oh, absolutely.
How do you know at the point at which it gets implanted into the body that it's going to be safe for the course of a whole human lifetime? How do you? So you basically don't know.
Yeah.
But basically, you're going to have to extrapolate data and previous knowledge sets, and there will be a process that relates to it that says, to an extent, based on risk management and the regulatory approvals, that on the balance of evidence it should be safe. It's the follow-up, it's the post-market surveillance that then provides the safety net for that.
But I suppose one of the issues here is that if you're the patient and you're having a device implanted in that scenario where to understand whether it's safe is going to be a post-market surveillance process, then don't you have a right to know that before the device is implanted?
I think there should be a right to have all of the information that's possibly available given to the patient. Certainly I would expect to have that.
Including what we don't know as well.
What you don't know, because as a patient, I don't, as I said, have a medical qualification. If I was having an implant, there's lots of things I'm not going to know about it, but I would hope that someone would tell me.
Including what the system, the clinician, the manufacturer, the regulator doesn't know, as well as what the...
It's a very good point, and maybe we should do more communication around that helps patients understand it. People tend to know what pills they're taking, but when something's being placed inside them, it feels a lot more complicated from a layperson's perspective, and there's a massive duty of trust there on the clinical community to advise the individual. And anything that we can do going forward, if there is something that we're not doing at the moment we could do differently, very open to understanding that.
When a new product is introduced to the market, we now have the Beyond Compliance program, certainly for the joints.
Yes, on the AJL. Yeah.
What is the industry view about Beyond Compliance?
We've been part of that process right from the beginning, actually, and we've advocated that sort of additional requirement. Sadly, I don't think that it's only really just beginning to take hold in the rest of Europe, actually. So the UK, in many ways, leads that process.
But is that the way forward, that you have a very limited, restrictive intro into the market, you see how it works, you test it, then you think about widening the amount of procedures or devices?
Possibly. I think one of the things which, if I can just come back, I'll come back to that. I've parked it. I'll come back to that question. But to answer again, one of those things we were talking about earlier on, it's one of the areas which the new regulation is definitely tightening up on for two reasons. Firstly, because first of all, there's a constant review and up classification of products within the coverage of the medical device regulation. So in some of these areas where you do find products which are wanting, if that's the right word, they're up classified and you therefore sort of require more clinical data or whatever. What I will say is that the regulations require every product, irrespective of whether they are a wheelchair or a hip implant or a mesh or a CAT scanner. They have to satisfy criteria of quality, safety and performance. Now, the satisfaction of the performance requirement is quite often determined by the risk of the product that it presents to the product. To the patient, sorry. Now, if you are got a low risk product, you wouldn't necessarily want to conduct clinical investigations on product. You might want to do clinical evaluations, which is just a review of data or whatever. the higher the risk of the product, the more emphasis there is on clinical investigation. And I think that's what's happening with some of these sort of more high-risk products that we're talking about today. The other important thing is around clinical equivalence and stuff like that. I know there's been quite a lot of criticism as to whether or not products should be evaluated using clinical equivalence claims, and that is actually changing ever such a lot with the new regulation, whereas where equivalence is almost being pushed to the side, and with high risk products there is a real emphasis for manufacturers to conduct specific investigations of products, which is a very good thing. What is also coming out of the system is that for high risk products particularly, and in answer to some of the things which Peter actually highlighted, a lot of that clinical investigation work and the product safety information is going to be published on the European database called EUDAMED, which actually has some elements of transparency. So as a concerned citizen, you would be able to look to see whether your high-risk product has gone through a certain regulatory process and everything. So that the new regulations are really trying to aim at increasing that transparency, but also the robustness of how products are tested.
Is EUDAMED coming in 2020?
It's coming in just prior to the end of the transition period for the regulation, which is around May 2020.
And you're confident about that?
That's all of the intelligence that I've had from the people who have been working on those working groups, that there are that it's going to be in place by that date, yes.
And when you say that EUDAMED will give details of the pre-marketing processes, does that include, what level of detail are we?
It will include things like product safety update reports and some of the clinical summaries that have been generated by the company for review by the notified bodies. So that information will be publicly available.
But will it include details, for example, of, say, all of the pre-market approval and certification that's been sought? So if it's been through
EUDAMED is
notified body.
EUDAMED is also going to include details of registration processes and that sort of stuff. And as part of that registration process, I don't know the full detail, but I would fully expect that there will be, in the same way that the MHRA runs their registration processes at the moment for Class 1 products, there would be a sort of a detail of what product has been placed on the market, the certification that it's obtained, the conformity assessment routes that it's followed, that sort of information.
But whether the conformity assessment has been rejected.
Whether it will include data, I don't know whether it will say whether it's been rejected, but it will certainly say that whether the products that are on the market have been covered.
I mean, one of the anxieties that patients and actually others have expressed to us many times is that the use of tape for stress urinary incontinence went from a technique which was being introduced slowly under review to universal, almost without any further evaluation other than information from the manufacturer saying it was safe. Have I got that right?
The CERNET reclassification,
yes.
I think it was 97,
2002.
2002.
Yeah, so that's the background to this conversation, that the history suggests that it wasn't introduced in a way which...
In a control.
Yeah.
And in a way that the two-category jump was initiated by a manufacturer requesting that, is what we have been told.
Right.
As I say, we don't know what happens within the individual companies themselves.
I think what's important in that is that we
CERNET.
find a way of making sure that going forward, if that was the case, then there's control around that. And I think with what Phil was describing in terms of the new regulations, I think there are controls in place for that. And again, working in a structured way, and I think surety comes from structure with the clinical community. If it's a registry process, and that's a generic term, but if it's a well-structured registry process, then there should be ways of enabling there to be gateways I mean, to the point about the NJR, the National Joint Registry, and how far you restrict. I mean, there is a balance here with sense around avoiding patient harm, that if technologies are available that can solve health problems, that they are available to people on the basis that they are as safe as soon as they can be.
That's the big if.
And that's the big balancing factor in here.
Yeah.
If it can solve without doing harm.
Yes, absolutely.
So going back to your question, going back to your question on long-term implantables and how those are sort of introduced. I can only talk about hips and knees because that's where my background is on orthopedics. But in those sorts of instances, what you're doing with your CE mark is understanding how your product performs in the short term. So in order to get a CE mark, perhaps for a new hip, you're looking at maybe doing 2 or 3 years worth of clinical investigation work now as a class 3 product before you would be able to apply the CE mark. Now, as you quite rightly say, the implantation time of that hip may be 10 years. So I think that there is a responsibility then through the regulation, through the post-marketing stuff, to ensure that those hips are followed up at sensible intervals to ensure that it's still performing as a hip. And that is then sort of, as I say, fed back into your clinical work, fed back into your risk management work. So having said that, I think as Peter said, there's that balancing act between demonstrating performance and being able to sort of satisfy those regulatory requirements whilst ensuring that you have the innovation available to produce those hips in the first place. There is an argument to suggest that maybe if we were waiting for a 10-year or an 8-year clinical investigation for a new hip, we probably wouldn't have very many new hips coming onto the market. Yet we know that some of those technologies have really helped patients in certain instances. We know that there have been instances where that hasn't.
That's the issue we were touching on earlier,
right.
That there's natural tension between innovation and safety.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that the National Joint Registry talked to us about earlier was the way they're funded. So they're funded from what is in effect a levy. It's now a shared levy between providers, i.e. trusts, and manufacturers. But the manufacturers get an awful lot of benefit, use out of the data that is collected, and it's as long as it's put to proper use by the manufacturers and there are proper safeguards in place around how they use that data, then that's a very good thing. Would you, as an industry body, would you support similar approaches if there are going to be other registrars, for example, in relation to mesh? So
yes. So
the manufacturers, in the case of mesh, make a contribution via a levy to fund that registry.
Yeah, I think as we said earlier, any registry that seeks, particularly on high-risk products, to improve safety and improve clinical practice has got to be something that we would be seen to be supporting, and that we would encourage, because it's been proven with the NJR that you can include clinical practice. It was the same with the heart registries. Again, it moves up continually the bar of clinical practice and consequently good outcomes. So be very happy to take those discussions further and certainly bring industry around the table where we can to help further those discussions.
Do you think in the case of mesh, do you think that there is a responsibility for the manufacturers to contribute to some of the problems that patients are facing in terms of their care, in terms of what they're having to go through at the moment? Do you think there is some sort of responsibility, even if it's a moral one, that the manufacturers ought to be contributing towards those costs?
If I was a lawyer, I'd say no comment. I'm not a lawyer.
Sorry?
If I was a lawyer, I'd say no comment. But I'm not a lawyer, and I think of course there's a responsibility on all of us to try and improve patients who've received harm. I can't possibly comment though on individual cases. I can't speak for those companies, but as an individual, yes, I think we should all collaborate and find ways to improve the circumstances these patients find themselves in, and that's just a question of a lot longer discussion with the companies, with the clinical community as well. Happy to contribute to those discussions.
But I mean, there are precedents in terms of the ASR HIP scheme, which wasn't a compensation fund, but was provision of care that was industry, came down from industry. So, I mean, this isn't an unknown.
It's not an unknown. I mean, I'm not an expert, clinical expert on the mesh case, so it would be wrong of me to put words into the mouths of companies in that respect. But intuitively, the process of collaboration around that makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to sound insensitive to it, it's just I'm not there to represent those particular instances. But yes, we would like to collaborate around that.
One of the concerns that has been raised with us many times is around the relationship between manufacturers and clinicians. And this goes, I mean, it relates to mesh, but it arguably goes wider.
Sure.
And a desire on the part of patients and others to make sure that those relationships are proper and transparent as well. And I know in relation to the pharmaceutical industry, one of the things they've done to try to address that is to have their own code, the ABHI code in this country. There isn't an equivalent, is there yet, for devices?
There is.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, how does that work?
So it is not dissimilar. The ABPI code is enshrined in legislation. Ours is something the industry introduced itself, along with consultation with the clinical community, and it's fundamentally designed to ensure that the critical relationship for the development of technology that improves patients' outcomes and their health is the innovator, often a clinician, and the company that enables the manufacture of that product. It's a very, very important relationship. But it has to be seen to be a good relationship and one that is not compromised in any way. So our code has been a mandatory code for the industry since 2008 in the UK. It means if you're a member of ABHI, you have to attest to the fact that you follow this code of practice. And each year, when a company rejoins us, they attest to the fact that they'll follow that code. We do a lot of work with our European colleagues on whom the code is modelled, and with the US again, where there is a code and a different set of arrangements legally in the US that says we should have these relationships protected so that they can be sustained. Happy to share our code with you subsequent to this, so you can have copies of that.
And does it cover the relationship with the clinician, so the clinician is not personally benefiting?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it does.
So the idea is that there is an ethic. It's called an ethical code of business practice. So that relationship is a trusted relationship.
Can you send it to us, please?
Yes, of course we will.
I think the major difference though between yours and the ABPI is that yours doesn't have the legal underpinnings in the same way, does it?
No, and I don't pretend to understand the structure related to the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, ours is tougher than the Bribery Act. It's modelled around the constraints of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, which are designed to ensure that there is ethical behaviour on both sides.
So can I just look it up on the internet? Can I look
Yes,
at a company and
absolutely.
it would show me which clinicians,
absolutely.
for example, might have been supported via studies or whatever else? And
So the transparency of payments is coming through this year through the European database. But the elements of our code are available on our website, but I will send you a link to that.
But as a patient, as it stands right now, I can't see if my treating clinician has received funding from a particular manufacturer.
No.
and will be able to in the future? Is that what you're saying?
They will see whether the funding has gone to an institution, because we've stopped paying money to individual clinicians other than through recognised research grants. So, for example, I wouldn't be able to provide you with funding direct to go to a conference for travel,
etc.
etc.
Study that I was involved in.
Sorry?
We could support a research study.
But we could support a research study, and that information would be then done on a contract between you, the institution you work for, and the company.
As Peter said, actually, the code is very much modelled on the European code. In fact, our UK code is slightly more robust in that it actually includes requirements for advertising and promotion, which the European codes don't.
And that's sort of a direct parallel with the ABHI code, the pharmaceutical code, around the fairness and truthfulness of evidence that's used in marketing material.
Yeah.
And of course that will in turn be governed by the Advertising Standards Association as well.
Can I just ask you, one of the issues that we've been thinking about is this equivalence, that you start
Yes.
with a product and then it changes a bit and then it's used for a different purpose and so on. And what I don't understand is there a break where it gets so far that you have to relicense it, or you have to reconsider whether it should be used for that purpose or whatever? Is there some mechanism for
Yes,
that?
and I think Phil was alluding to that in one of his earlier remarks about how things are changing as well.
Yes.
And that will be in the new regulations?
Yes, which is in the process of being
Yes,
implemented.
equivalence is actually specifically mentioned in the new regulation.
Great.
So if you're demonstrating clinical performance, there are essentially three ways of doing that for a product. You either conduct clinical investigations, you conduct a clinical evaluation, or you do a combination of the two. Now, depending on the risk of the product, as you know, class 3 is the highest risk and class 1 is the lowest. Depending on the classification of the product, depends on how you would effectively model that or structure that sort of clinical performance effort. So when it comes to clinical equivalence, there has been up until now, in the same way that the FDA system works, an understanding that there is a potential for saying, right, okay, well, my product is similar to the guy that's making one down the road, therefore my product, and I know that works, therefore my product must be of the same standing. What the notified bodies, however, look for when they are addressing the technical side of products, when they're reviewing technical files and they're looking at that specific part of the technical file which relates to performance, they will be looking specifically with their clinical experts as to whether or not that equivalence is appropriate or not. So that's a check pre-CE mark, if you like, as to how that sort of goes. With the new regulation, it goes further by suggesting that you cannot claim equivalence to a product unless you have a mandate from the company who you are claiming equivalence to have their technical information in order to make your equivalence claim. So that means if I'm going to make an equivalence claim to a product which you're making, I have to write to you and say, can you send me your technical information on your product because I want to claim equivalence to it. Now that is seen as almost an insurmountable hurdle now, because there are going to be no company that I would know of. If I was to write to you and say, can I have your technical file on your product, they're going to say, no, you're not going to have that.
But
So
can you claim equivalence on in relation to a product you yourself have developed?
So if you are manufacturing it, let's go back to an infusion pump. Let's say an infusion pump. If you're developing a new iteration of the infusion pump which you yourself make, yes, then you wouldn't necessarily contract yourself to supply the technical file. So you would use the data, potentially, that's in your existing technical file to support the performance of your new product. In those instances, though, of course, the notified body still comes in and makes sure that the performance data that you have for your new product is appropriate for your CE mark. So there is that additional check. But essentially, yes, equivalence can be claimed within a company's product grouping, but it's becoming increasingly more difficult to do that between different companies.
The
because
CE
of
mark
that
covers the
confidentiality.
whole of Europe, doesn't it?
The CE mark covers the whole of Europe.
So if country A gives you a mark, is country B obliged to accept that?
Yes, the CE mark is seen as like a, somebody said nobody really knows the derivation of where it comes from, but I think it comes from conformity European. So it effectively means that if your product, if you're a German manufacturer and you use a...
So the obvious question, I'm mindful of the time,
Sure.
is
Sorry.
what's going to happen?
Right, good question. So the MHRA have categorically said that they will still use the MDR as their regulatory base for a time-limited period. We fully expect that to be around 2 years.
And we're confident that the standards applied in country A are the same as country B.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's not the same point. I think, yes, there was... so some years ago there was a reduction in the number of notified bodies across Europe. There was some stuff that was in the press around the quality of some of the notified bodies. We collaborated with the Science and Technology Committee at the time, with MHRA and others right across Europe to recommend a reduction in the number of notified bodies.
And we're now confident that we're confident across the piece that they're working to the same sort of level.
I think we are confident that the competent authorities, so MHRA and its equivalents in other jurisdictions, have got a good mechanism for scrutinising the quality of those notified bodies.
So
much better than it was a number of years ago.
Is forum shopping still a problem?
Sorry?
Shopping around still a problem?
Not that I believe it is.
No,
I think
no. As a manufacturer, of course, you decide who you want as your notified body, assuming that they have the scope in order to cover the product that you are intending to CE mark. Does anyone collect data on how many notified bodies get involved in an approval process for any given device? For any given device, if you are placing a product on the market, your CE mark normally is affixed with a number, and that number relates directly to the notified body who has been dealing with that particular product from a technical
But
perspective.
if the manufacturers had to go to more than one notified body to get to that point, is there ever a record?
They wouldn't. So a manufacturer would use only one notified body per product. They wouldn't use more than one notified
I
body.
think the question that's been raised with us is that one of the things that people have suspicions is that a product will be taken to a notified body. They will say no, it doesn't reach the required safety standards. They will then take it to a second notified body.
to take that far with them.
Yes, I think that rigour that Peter was talking about within the Commission for reviewing those notified bodies is quite great. There are two mechanisms for that. There's the Notified Body Oversight Group and a group called MBMed. I think the Notified Body Oversight Group is where the notified bodies are reviewed by the Commission and the competent authorities to make sure that they're working from on the same standards and on the same guidelines, if you like. And the Notified Body NBMed is where the notified bodies come to collective decisions as to how they're going to review certain aspects. One of those sorts of aspects might well be the clinical performance investigations of the company.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to.
Sorry,
just
can I
find
just answer that
yes.
again, just
Yeah.
very briefly? I think the point you raise is a very clear one. I suggest we take that away and we see if we can do some more digging and get
Fantastic.
you more comprehensive evidence that that is not a problem, that, as you stated, if you don't get it approved there, if I can paraphrase, you can go somewhere else and see if they'll do it.
Yes.
That is not the intention of the regulations to allow that. That doesn't, under any court, stand clear, smells. But we'll get you the elements out of the regulations that I think may well satisfy that question in a bit more detail.
Thank you, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to ask my team, any further questions?
Thank
you.
No further questions. Any questions for us?
No other than just to say if we can continue to contribute in any way, then please do ask us.
Thank you very much.
Happy to do that.